Like, you have to be thankful. Like, yes, you're thankful. Yeah, I'm thankful, but I have to go to this next meeting. It's like, no. We were able to really have so much time.
The message arrived without royal letterhead, without an official schedule, and without the usual chain of palace approval. Yet, it offered Meghan something she had been denied for years, a private entrance into Highgrove, 47 minutes behind closed doors, and a chance to change everything. It was not described as reconciliation. There was no mention of forgiveness, family healing, or a long-awaited conversation with Charles. The wording was colder than that. Meghan was being offered a confidential discussion connected to Highgrove, arranged beyond the public calendar and protected by an expectation of complete silence. No announcement, no photographs, no confirmation afterward. To Meghan, that secrecy suggested possibility. To Harry, it suggested danger. Highgrove was not simply another royal residence. It carried the weight of Harry's childhood, his father's private life, and memories of Diana that had never fully loosened their grip on him. It represented a world he had once belonged to without question, and now approached as though every doorway required permission. Even hearing its name reopened emotions he preferred to keep buried. Harry studied the invitation for signs of Charles's involvement, but found none. It did not explain who had requested Meghan's presence. It offered no proper agenda and gave no assurance that his father would attend. That absence disturbed him more than any direct warning could have. Meghan saw something different. She believed the meeting might concern her title, the royal position of Archie and Lilibet, or a possible return to selected family occasions under tightly negotiated terms. For years, decisions about her had been made in rooms she could not enter. This time, she had been invited inside. Their disagreement began quietly. Meghan argued that refusing would allow the palace to keep controlling the story. Harry warned that accepting could place her alone before officials trained to turn pressure into polite conversation. Without witnesses, every promise could be denied and every refusal used against her. Then there was the time limit. Exactly 47 minutes. Not 45. Not an hour. 47. It sounded less like a family meeting and more like a controlled examination. The invitation also referred vaguely to a Highgrove document concerning private royal property, possessions connected to Diana, and conditions governing what Harry and Meghan could publicly describe as family inheritance. That changed the conversation. Harry suspected the palace was using memory as leverage. Meghan feared something larger, that several royal households already knew of the visit despite its promised secrecy. If that was true, she would not be entering a private discussion. She would be stepping into a contest between competing centers of royal power. Harry reminded her that Highgrove was Charles's sanctuary, controlled by people who understood hierarchy, silence, and pressure better than almost anyone. Meghan listened, but her decision had already hardened. She would attend. But she would not surrender her title, offer a public apology, or sign anything that weakened her children's connection to the royal family. But before Meghan could enter Highgrove, another private conversation was already taking place inside the estate. And the people shaping that meeting were preparing for an outcome neither she nor Harry had been told to expect. While Meghan prepared for what she believed might be a royal breakthrough, Highgrove's inner circle was preparing for something far colder. Documents were arranged, advisors were briefed, and one chair was deliberately left empty because this meeting was never designed to give Meghan equal power. The discussion had been organized by a small group of senior advisors who believed Harry and Meghan still possessed something the palace could not fully control: royal connection without royal obedience. Their names, titles, and family history continued to carry weight across interviews, business ventures, and public appearances. To those inside the institution, that influence was no longer merely uncomfortable. It was a threat that had to be contained. Charles knew enough to understand that a meeting was being arranged, yet he had avoided becoming its official host. That distance gave his advisors room to speak with royal authority while protecting the king from direct confrontation. If the conversation succeeded, Charles could approve the outcome. If it failed, others could be blamed for going too far. At the center of the room stood an empty chair. It had originally been prepared for Harry. Early plans assumed he would attend beside Meghan, but the arrangement had quietly changed. No formal explanation was given. By the time the invitation reached them, Meghan was expected to face the discussion alone, without a lawyer, assistant, recording device, or security representative inside the room. The agenda had been divided into 3 sensitive areas: the Sussex title, future access to private royal residences, and the ownership or custody of objects connected to Diana. Each subject carried its own danger. Together, they formed a pressure point capable of reopening every wound Harry believed the palace had never truly understood. The advisors intended to present their proposal as generosity. Meghan could be welcomed into selected royal spaces. She might attend carefully chosen family occasions. Archie and Lilibet could receive limited private access to their grandfather's world. But the offer came with strict boundaries on interviews, commercial projects, and public statements involving the monarchy. A confidentiality agreement waited among the papers. Its language went far beyond ordinary privacy. It could prevent Meghan from discussing conversations involving Charles, Camilla, William, or Catherine, even if those conversations later became the subject of anonymous palace briefings. Harry had seen this pattern before. Verbal assurances would be offered in soft language, then denied once the moment had passed. That history left him convinced that Meghan should accept nothing unwritten and sign nothing she could not challenge. Inside the palace, however, even the proposed compromise had created division. Charles's household wanted controlled reconciliation. William's representatives feared that restoring Meghan's access would restore her influence and create a future constitutional problem. Meanwhile, someone connected to Camilla had insisted that Meghan answer past allegations before receiving any symbolic welcome. The meeting was no longer a conversation. It had become a test of submission. And waiting inside the room was the most dangerous item of all, a sealed inventory connected to Diana, including possessions Harry believed would one day pass to him or his children. By the time Meghan's car approached the estate, the meeting had already been transformed from a possible reconciliation into a carefully staged contest over loyalty, inheritance, and who would control the Sussex story next. Meghan arrived expecting tension, but not silence. No family member waited at the entrance. No warm message came from Charles. Instead, she was led through Highgrove by an official who refused to answer one simple question. Was the king actually inside the house? Her arrival had been arranged with unusual secrecy. She was directed through a less visible entrance, away from the route normally associated with guests, cameras, and official welcomes. The explanation was privacy. But to Meghan, it felt like containment. The palace did not want photographs, speculation, or witnesses who might later confirm how she had been received. Harry's absence followed her into every moment. She had chosen to enter alone, knowing that whatever happened inside could later become a battle between her account and the palace's carefully controlled version. There would be no one beside her to challenge a denial. No one to hear the exact wording of a promise or threat. Before reaching the meeting room, Meghan asked again whether Charles would attend. The official paused, then replied that the king was aware of the discussion. It was a perfect palace answer, polite, precise, and empty. It confirmed knowledge without offering presence. Her phone was then secured outside the room under the justification of protecting sensitive royal material. In a single move, Meghan was cut off from Harry just as the meeting began. 3 people waited inside. A senior household representative sat beside a legal advisor connected to royal property. The third was introduced more carefully. Yet, the connection was unmistakable. This person carried the influence of Camilla's circle into the room. The imbalance was immediate. Prepared folders rested before the officials. Notes had been timed. Questions had been coordinated. Meghan had been given no written agenda and no chance to prepare a formal response. The first challenge came without warning. Did she still believe she was entitled to use royal status while remaining outside official duty? Meghan refused the premise. Her marriage could not be erased. Her children's heritage could not be rewritten. Her years inside the institution could not be dismissed simply because the palace disliked the way she described them. Then came the offer. Selected family occasions. Private access to Charles for Archie and Lilibet. Carefully managed contact with royal residences. But every privilege depended on strict limits governing Meghan's interviews, business activities, and public comments. The discussion soon became more personal. Harry's anger was raised. So was his distance from the family. The suggestion was subtle but brutal. Meghan was being treated as the force behind his separation. That was when she understood the deeper purpose. The meeting was not only designed to control her, it was designed to divide them, presenting cooperation with the palace as the only way to protect Harry's inheritance and his children's future. Then the sealed Diana inventory was placed in front of her. The first half of the visit had been uncomfortable, but still controlled. Then the sealed folder was opened, and within minutes, the 47-minute meeting began collapsing into the disaster Highgrove had hoped to keep secret. The disaster did not begin with shouting. It began with a single page bearing Diana's name, Harry's signature, and a condition Meghan had never seen before. By the 47th minute, the meeting was over, an advisor was demanding security, and Meghan was walking out without saying goodbye. The sealed inventory listed letters, jewelry, photographs, handwritten notes, and deeply personal objects connected to Diana. Some remained under royal custody. Others were controlled through private collections or family trusts. But to Harry, their emotional ownership had never been in doubt. They were fragments of his mother. Pieces of a past no-palace document could reduce to legal language. Then, Meghan found the condition attached to them. Harry's future access to certain items would depend on both of them accepting a sweeping confidentiality and conduct agreement. The proposed restrictions extended beyond the objects themselves. They covered disputes involving Diana's legacy, royal parenting, inheritance decisions, and the private treatment Harry and Meghan claimed to have experienced from senior members of the family. To Meghan, this was not property management. It was emotional pressure disguised as procedure. Diana's memory was being placed on one side of the table, silence on the other, and Harry was being forced to choose. The pressure deepened when one official suggested that Archie and Lilibet's future access to Highgrove and other private royal spaces could depend on their parents demonstrating sustained discretion. Meghan's restraint broke. She demanded to know whether Charles had personally approved the wording. The officials refused to answer directly. They said only that the document reflected the interests of the crown and the family. That answer made the trap unmistakable. Meghan accused them of using Charles's authority while preventing her from speaking to him. If the king supported the proposal, she wanted him to say so. If he did not, then his name was being used to force a decision he could later deny. Camilla's representative then raised Meghan's previous public allegations and suggested that trust could not be rebuilt until she privately acknowledged the damage she had caused. Meghan refused. The palace, she argued, wanted confession without accountability. It demanded regret from her while ignoring leaks, isolation, hostile briefings, and the emotional pressure that had driven Harry further away. At the 47th minute, Meghan stood and reached for a copy of the agreement. An advisor moved to stop her, insisting the pages were private royal material and could not leave the room. Meghan held on to one sheet and demanded written proof that the meeting had taken place. security was called. Not because she threatened anyone, but because she would not surrender the page. She eventually left the folder behind. But she kept a handwritten note containing names, exact phrases, and the inheritance condition that had ended the meeting. Charles never entered, although he was close enough to be told the discussion had collapsed. Outside, Meghan contacted Harry immediately. Highgrove had not been a peace offering, she told him. It had been an attempt to make them choose between silence and Diana. The 47-minute visit was finished, but the real disaster had only begun. Because once Harry heard what had been placed in front of Meghan, his anger shifted away from the advisors and directly toward his father. Harry could have blamed the advisors, the lawyers, or the household officials who cornered Meghan. Instead, he focused on the one person who never appeared. To Harry, Charles's absence was not neutrality, it was permission, and it reopened a wound older than Meghan's arrival. Meghan's account left him furious. It was not only the confidentiality agreement or the attempt to restrict what they could say. It was the suggestion that access to Diana's possessions, Highgrove, and even the children's relationship with the royal family might depend on their silence. To Harry, that crossed a line the palace should never have approached. He tried to reach Charles directly. Each attempt was redirected through private secretaries, carefully worded responses, and promises that the king would be informed. The distance felt deliberate. Charles had been close enough to know the meeting had collapsed. Yet once again, Harry was being forced to speak to the machinery surrounding his father rather than the man himself. Highgrove made that absence more painful. Harry remembered it as the place where he had once searched for his father's attention, waiting for moments of warmth that often disappeared beneath duty. Now the pattern seemed unchanged. Charles was physically near, but emotionally unreachable. Harry accused the palace of repeating its oldest method of control. It used access, security, titles, money, and inheritance to reward obedience and punish resistance. This time, Diana's memory had become part of the pressure. Meghan urged caution. She knew an angry public statement could be used against him. The palace could describe him as unstable, impulsive, and incapable of private negotiation, then point to his reaction as proof that the Highgrove restrictions were necessary. But Harry did not want patience. He wanted exposure. That created a new tension between them. Meghan wanted every phrase documented before they acted. Harry wanted the world to know immediately what had happened. His anger soon turned toward William. Some of the Diana-linked items overlapped with responsibilities connected to the future king, and Harry found it impossible to believe his brother knew nothing. A private message from William's office denied involvement. It also warned Harry not to turn Diana's memory into another public conflict. The warning only deepened his fury. To Harry, it sounded less like concern and more like preparation. William was already defending the institution before asking what had actually happened. Charles eventually sent a brief response. He claimed he had never authorized anyone to threaten access to family relationships. Yet, he did not reject the disputed document, withdraw its conditions, or explain why he had refused to enter the room. The ambiguity was almost worse than a confession. Had the advisors exceeded their authority, or had Charles remained distant so he could deny responsibility if the plan failed? Then, Harry learned that another document existed. It contained recommendations concerning the Sussex title and outlined what the palace should do if he and Meghan rejected the Highgrove conditions. Harry's confrontation produced no apology, no withdrawal, and no clear denial. Instead, it exposed a second threat moving quietly through the palace, one that could transform a failed private meeting into a permanent royal separation. Behind the argument over Diana's possessions was a far more explosive question. Palace advisors had begun examining whether Meghan's title could be restricted without creating a public constitutional battle, and the failed Highgrove visit had given them the justification they were waiting for. The confidential recommendation did not begin with formal removal. That would be too dramatic, too public, and too difficult to explain without reopening every wound between the Sussexes and the Crown. Instead, the proposal focused on something quieter, reducing the title's practical value until it remained visible in name but weakened everywhere that mattered. Official websites could be rewritten. Invitations could avoid royal styling. Ceremonial recognition could disappear. Private correspondence might use different forms of address, while commercial projects connected to Meghan could face new objections whenever the Sussex name appeared too close to royal authority. Nothing would be taken away in a single announcement. The title would simply be emptied from the inside. Meghan understood the strategy immediately. To her, this was symbolic erasure without the political cost of openly stripping her status. The palace could claim nothing had changed while slowly rewriting how the public understood her place in royal history. William's concerns sat at the center of the recommendation. Once he became king, advisors feared the Sussex title could create long-term confusion, especially if Meghan continued high-profile work outside Britain while remaining visibly connected to the monarchy. To William's circle, the issue was not only personal resentment, it was future control. Charles was less certain. He wanted to protect the crown's authority, but a decisive break with Harry could destroy what remained of his relationship with Archie and Lilibet. Every restriction risked pushing his son further away. Camilla's position was harder. In her view, reconciliation without submission would reward defiance. If Meghan returned to royal spaces without acknowledging past damage, the family's internal order would appear weaker. For Meghan, the deepest betrayal was the timing. The title discussion had not emerged after Highgrove failed. It may have been connected to the visit from the beginning. The meeting had offered access with one hand while preparing symbolic punishment with the other. Harry saw the title as secondary. He cared more about his father, his children, and the possibility of restoring family contact. Meghan saw the danger differently. If the title were weakened, the palace could use that change to rewrite their entire story, presenting them not as royals who left, but as outsiders who had never truly belonged. The palace also knew Meghan possessed detailed notes from Highgrove. Any action against her title might provoke the release of the inheritance condition involving Diana. That threat divided the monarchy. One faction wanted a clean break. Another wanted a private settlement. A third feared that punishing Meghan would only make her more powerful beyond palace control. Then came the twist. Charles's advisors were considering a separate path back for Harry alone. Harry recognized the trap immediately. Accepting might restore his connection to his father, but it would confirm Meghan's darkest suspicion, that the palace had always intended to separate them. The title threat was dangerous, but the separate offer to Harry was even more devastating, because it forced him to choose between the family he had lost and the woman the palace still treated as the price of his return. The proposal sounded compassionate: private visits, renewed contact with Charles, and a future role at family ceremonies, but Meghan's name appeared nowhere. The palace was no longer asking Harry to negotiate with his wife beside him, it was offering him a way back only if he returned alone. Under the arrangement, Harry could return for private visits, rebuild direct contact with his father, and bring Archie and Lilibet under carefully controlled conditions. He might even be included in selected family ceremonies once trust had been restored. Meghan, however, would remain outside the formal discussions. Her absence was described as temporary, practical, and necessary. For Harry, the offer reached into the deepest part of him. It promised a father he still wanted, a brother he had not stopped mourning, and a sense of belonging he had spent years pretending he no longer needed. Yet every promise carried the same hidden message the family could imagine his return, but not hers. Meghan remained calm when he told her. That calm cost her more than anger would have. She said the decision had to be his. She would not become the reason he was accused of losing his family again. But beneath that control was a private heartbreak. The palace had placed her outside the door, then invited Harry to walk through it without her. Royal advisers framed the proposal as protection rather than punishment. Trust with Meghan, they argued, needed to be rebuilt slowly. Harry's relationship with Charles should not suffer while that process continued. The language sounded reasonable. Meghan saw something far more dangerous. Separate visits would create separate loyalties. Separate conversations would produce separate promises. And eventually, separate versions of what had happened at Highgrove would begin to compete. Harry feared that rejecting the offer could reduce his children's future contact with their grandfather. Accepting it, however, might damage the trust holding his marriage together. The choice was designed so that every path carried loss. Then a message connected to William's office arrived. Meaningful reconciliation, it said, required Harry to demonstrate independence. Harry understood the word differently. Independence did not mean freedom from palace pressure. It meant distance from Meghan. To him, the message proved his brother still saw the marriage as the obstacle rather than the institution's refusal to accept it. Public image became another weapon. If Harry returned alone, the palace could present him as moving toward peace. If he refused, Meghan could be blamed for preventing reconciliation. She still chose not to release her Highgrove notes. For now, they remained protection against whatever the palace might say next. Then the first leak appeared. It described the visit as calm, constructive, and focused on family healing. Meghan knew it was false. More troubling was a detail about the seating arrangement that had never been shared outside the room. Someone inside Highgrove was already rewriting the disaster. The palace had begun shaping the public story. But the false account contained a detail only 4 people could have known, giving Meghan the first real clue about who had engineered the 47-minute confrontation. The public was told the visit had been respectful, private, and hopeful. Meghan knew otherwise. Then one report mentioned the empty chair prepared for Harry, a detail never shared outside the room, and suddenly the disaster was no longer just about royal pressure. It was about betrayal. That single detail changed everything. The empty chair had belonged to an earlier version of the meeting, before Harry was quietly removed from the arrangement. Only the people involved in planning the encounter, and those seated inside the room, could have known it existed. For Meghan, the leak proved that confidentiality had never applied equally. She had been asked to surrender her phone, enter without support, and protect every word spoken at Highgrove. Palace representatives, however, still possessed the power to release selected details anonymously, shaping public opinion while refusing to attach a name to the story. Harry wanted the notes published immediately. He believed silence would allow the palace account to harden into accepted truth. Once the visit was remembered as calm and constructive, any later challenge could be dismissed as anger, exaggeration, or revenge. Meghan resisted. Her handwritten record contained references to Diana, Charles, Archie, and Lilibet, private royal property, and the condition tied to Harry's inheritance. Releasing it might expose the pressure placed on them, but it could also destroy relationships that had already been stretched close to breaking. Charles was said to be furious that confidential information had escaped. Yet he still refused to confirm publicly that the meeting had occurred. To Harry, that contradiction revealed the monarchy's true priority. The institution would condemn the leak in private, while continuing to benefit from the version it created. There was another possibility. The source might not have been one of Charles's closest advisors. A rival faction could have leaked the detail to sabotage any remaining chance of reconciliation and force the king into a harder position. William understood how dangerous the dispute could become. If the Highgrove papers emerged, The conflict would no longer concern one failed meeting. It could expand into Diana's legacy, royal inheritance, the Sussex title, and the treatment of Archie and Lilibet. Camilla's household denied responsibility. Privately, however, its position remained severe. Meghan's reaction proved she had never entered Highgrove prepared to rebuild trust. The long-term consequence arrived quietly. Future communication would pass through lawyers, private secretaries, or senior officials. The family would speak more carefully and understand one another less. Harry finally saw what the visit had destroyed. It had not merely failed. It had ended his last belief that private family conversations could exist beyond palace strategy. Meghan placed her handwritten note in a secure file. She did not release it. One sentence recorded during the final minute remained hidden. A sentence that could reveal who truly authorized the ultimatum. The 47 minutes ended at Highgrove, but the secret recorded in Meghan's final note ensured the confrontation would never truly be over, and that the palace could never be certain when its most dangerous private decision might finally become public.